So today I'm working on a demo video and it's of a piece using the Spanish city, using a postcard image of the Spanish city which is printed onto fabric. About a year ago I ran this as a 4-hour workshop at Love the North in Whitley Bay. So it is going to be a very much abridged version of the workshop. But what I want to do is basically run through my sort of approach to doing a landscape textile piece using an old image. And some of the basic techniques that we cover to kind of bring this together. So, to start off with, I like to work quite often with inkjet cottons. They are available online. Even if you just go on Amazon, you can find inkjet cottons, and they are basically a cotton which you buy in A4 sheets, and it's backed with paper, so you can send it through your inkjet printer. So if you can scan in an old photograph, or you have a current photograph that you want to print, you can print on it onto cotton as if you were printing onto paper. So it's a really versatile fabric to work with. Sometimes when you stitch with it, it can feel a little bit more difficult. You can feel a little bit more pressure as you try to push the needle through photo fabric compared to just sort of regular cotton, but it's designed to be stitched. So it is doable. You just might feel a little bit more resistance as you push a needle through. So what I do when I approach these is I print these onto cotton, and then I sort of look at the bands of colour in the landscape. So this one in particular, I'm kind of stuck with the idea that it was a really sort of, it's not quite black and white, it's sort of a sepia photograph. So when I did the bands of colour in the landscape, I don't go bright. I try to sort of keep them quite muted because it's fitting with the black and white photograph. So when I do this one's quite a shorter one. It's a bit of a Blue Peter. Here's one I made earlier. So I've got sort of a couple of working samples, so I don't take too long to do this. So I'd kind of imagine that you'd go from the Spanish city and then you'd go down to the grassy banks, you'd have paved areas, you'd go from sand and then ultimately you'd go to sea. So you could put some more grey or grey-blue tones on the bottom of this as well. So it's just imagining those steps and those bands of colour as you go from grass to sand to sea. So for this you'll need a selection of fabrics that you can work with. So I've kind of grouped mine into grass, sand and sea with different colours, but you can see they're all quite muted. And I only use snippets of them. I only use really, really small snippets. I don't kind of use big bits of fabric, and I cut them quite roughly as well, because by cutting them roughly you can create lots of nice texture on a piece like this. You'll also need a piece of cloth to work on, like a base piece of cloth. Now I've just got a piece of linen here. It's an old linen tablecloth. Because I work quite a lot with old fabrics, sometimes they can be quite fine. They've been washed and they've been used quite a lot over the years, so they can feel a bit flimsy sometimes. So what I also do, you can see just underneath here, is I have a little piece of bump, just a bit of curtain bump, or even white felt would do the trick, or even just a second piece of cloth. Just something to stabilise that top piece of fabric that you're going to stitch into a lot. So as I say, I use bump, but you could use felt. If you've got iron on interfacing in the house, you could iron some interfacing onto the back of your fabric. Just something to sturdy up that kind of ground, that background piece of fabric that you're going to use. So you have your background piece of cloth with your bump underneath. You've got an image printed onto inkjet cotton, and you've got some fabrics to work with. I always have a little cotton reel of white thread nearby. I'll show you why I use that in a minute. That's to sort of secure everything. You'll need needles and threads, pins, scissors, and if you've got some Bondweb, which is just a paperback glue basically, you might be familiar with it. That's really helpful to have. You don't need it, you can just use pins, but I find that when I'm trying to bond down the photograph onto the fabric, I like it to be really nice and flat, so I tend to use Bondweb just to get that really nice flat finish, and I'll go through how you can use that soon as well. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is we need to get this onto your fabric. Now it's a bit clunky at the minute because it's a big A4. It's like an A6 postcard, so we need to make it a bit smaller. Now some of the things I really like from this are things like the Pleasure Gardens Whitley Bay text there. So what I tend to do is I keep all of the little bits of text, and then they reappear somewhere else in the collage later on. So first things first, if you've printed this onto inkjet cotton, you need to get it off the paper backing. So you just, if you can get your nail into the corner, you can peel it off. Okay, and then you've got printed fabric. It's great stuff. If you've got Bondweb, you can iron this onto the back of your postcard. So Bondaweb's got a paper side and it's got a rough shiny glue side. So you need to make sure if you turn your postcard image over that you put the glue side, the rough glue side, face down onto the back of your postcard image, and then we can iron that in place. So I'm just going to go off and do that now and pop back. So that's ironed onto the back, so you can see now it's gone really flat, and that also will stabilise the cotton, and it'll just make it feel a little bit more papery again. And I find it's actually a little bit easier to cut the image out when it's got the Bondaweb on the back. If you don't have Bondaweb, don't worry, you can just cut the image out as you want to. It's fine, and you can pin and stitch it into place. It's I just find Bondaweb a little bit easier because it is like an iron-on glue, and also I like to cut around the Spanish City. I like to cut around all of these details here. So it does stabilise the fabric, so it makes it easier, and you get a really crisp, clean edge when you cut, because you're cutting through the edge that you're cutting through will have glue on the back, so it won't fray either. It kind of stops the fray of the fabric. So that's the next thing to do, is decide how you want to use your postcard. So you could use it as it is, and you could iron it on as it is. But as I say, I'm going to just quickly now, I'm going to cut around this as the skyline, because I want to sort of put the Spanish City onto the fabric, and then maybe I could do my own embroidery in the background for my own sky. So I'm going to just cut this out now and get rid of the sky, and then show you how to get it in place. Okay, so that's that cut out. You can see there now. It's got its own little sort of skyline. It's a little bit rough in some places, but it's hard sometimes to get close to the really small detail. Now, the next thing to do is get this in place. So as I say, if you haven't used Bondaweb, you can just pin and stitch. You can notice as well that I've cut my fabric, before I started, I cut my fabric the same width as the postcard. So when it sits, it's going to sit there like a bar right across the whole piece. Okay, so if you're using Bondaweb, all you need to do now is get rid of this paper backing to expose the glue underneath. So you've ironed it on, you've cut round it. Now you need to peel this paper backing off. And I don't know if it'll show up on the video, but it's quite shiny now on the back, and that is your glue side. So all you need to do now with a hot dry iron is take your work over to the ironing board, place that where you want it, and then give it a good iron, and that'll remelt the glue that's on the back of this postcard, and it'll set it into place. So then you can start to work with it, and this won't move, this will be secure for you. Okay, so that's in place now. That's just ironed in place with a nice hot dry iron for about 5 or 10 seconds, moving the iron across it, and that'll bond it enough. If you're worried that you might mark your iron or scorch your work, just cover it with a tea towel and that'll do the same job. The heat will still get through the tea towel. So the next thing we need to do now is we need to think about landscape. So if I can bring this a little bit closer to the camera, you can see that it's lots and lots of different bits of fabric all collaged in. And when I do these, I just kind of imagine that I talked before about grass, sand and sea. So we're going down in bands of colour, but you can add texture in, and this is nice because this is a bit where you can use a bit of creative license almost. But I kind of go in with little slices, so just coming in from the side almost. So I cut them really roughly. You don't have to be really neat. You don't have to cut in straight lines, you don't have to plan it. This is the nice bit. This is where you get to chop up lots of different fabrics and textures and really play with how they'll look working down this way. So it's kind of like making a big colour band, which describes the landscape. And we pin it all in place. So I'm going to do a little bit of that now, but I won't do all of it on this video because it will take a long time. I'll do a couple of pieces and then I'll do a quick time lapse so you can see how it builds up. But you're aiming for lots of different colours and textures. If you use a coloured picture, by all means use some fabrics that bring out the colours in the picture. I've just gone really muted today because I'm using, as I said before, a really old postcard photograph, so it is sort of quite sepia tone. So I'm sort of staying a little bit muted today with my colours. So I'm going to start off with some greens. Let's pop those out of the way. This is a really nice wool fabric. It sort of teases out and frays really nicely as well. Now when I cut my fabrics, I just wanted to show you this before I do the time lapse. I don't cut in a straight line. I tend to kind of just shave like that almost, so I just end up with these little slices of fabric, and you get all that lovely texture because you haven't just cut a straight line, you've kind of pulled at it while you cut. So you can get that nice texture that suggests things like maybe grass or sand or sea foam if you're working further down and you're thinking about waves and stuff. So I've got a few little pieces there cut already. And then I'm going to do a little bit with some printed cotton. This is some Laura Ashley cotton that I picked up at Tynemouth Market, just an offcut. And again, you can still, with this one, you can sort of shave it off and you can still get quite a nice texture if you don't cut that perfect straight line. So you remember, you're just suggesting bands of colours in the landscape. If anyone did my sketchbook prompts, we did do a whole prompt on colour bands and talked about how you can kind of communicate your ideas visually without drawing. You can do it with just using strips of colour, and I guess that's what this is a little bit. It's using colour to communicate the textures and the different areas of the landscape. Let's get the fluff off there. It does get a bit fluffy when you cut fabric like this because all the fibres go all over. So I've got some little pieces there now, just laid out. And I'm going to start laying them across. And as I say, this is the really nice bit because you just get to play a little bit. And just let them come in from either side. Don't worry about staying right to the edges either. It's actually quite nice with these pieces if your fabric goes over the edge. It's one of the things I like about framing textiles, is if you can see the raw edge. It's personal preference, so if you like to see the raw edge, then make the most of it. Go right over and out. So I'm just going to put a little glimpse of printed cotton in there. There's a little chap on this photograph with a nice straw hat on, so I'm not going to cover him up too much. I'm going to bring some more of this in here. So I'm just going to do a little bit of green for now, and then I shall do a time lapse. So there's a little bit of green. The next thing to do once you've started laying things in is to pin them in place. Now, obviously you can imagine when you've got this full of fabric, you would have a lot of pins in your work. And I know that when you start doing embroidery on top of this, the thing that always frustrates me is that your thread can get wrapped up horribly in all the pins, and it can slow things down and be really frustrating. So the next thing I'm going to show you is what I do to get rid of the pins before I do any surface embroidery to kind of decorate and pull the colours out of the landscape. Okay, so that's things in place there with a few pins. I just hold it up so you can see a little bit better, so nothing's going to fall off now. Okay, so it's all pinned in. So the next thing I do, if you can imagine that this was completely full now with colour, is I stab stitch everything in place with just some white machine cotton. And we do this stitch so that it can't be seen. And if it can be seen, you can pull it out at the end like a loose tacking stitch. But to be honest, most of the time you build up so many layers in these little collages that you just can't see these stitches, so they can just stay in really. Okay, so I've just threaded up a needle there with my white cotton, and all I'm going to do now, anchor it into the back of the piece. So this is where the curtain bump comes in quite useful, because you've got a much thicker piece to work with now because we're laying so much up onto it. Once it's done, it starts to feel quite substantial. It's nice to sew. So when you do a stab stitch, I'm going to bring it a little bit closer to the camera here, you're going to come up through your fabric and you're going to go down quite close to where you came out, so that when you pull your thread through, you don't see the stitch. The white just doesn't appear. And then about an inch away, do the same thing. So up and then back through, very close to where you came out. So I'm just doing it at sort of regular intervals. You can't see the stitches. They will disappear into the fabric. And it can be quite random. I tend to work across in rows, so I tend to stab stitch across, come down a bit, stab stitch across, and I would do that on the whole thing once everything is pinned into place. The nice thing about stab stitch is that once it's all done, you can take your pins out, so that when you do come to do hand embroidery later on, your hand embroidery threads don't get totally wound around the pins, which really winds me up. So I do this. It's kind of like a 10-minute job, but it's worth it because it just makes the next step a little bit easier. And also you can see your work a lot better because you've got rid of all of the pins. Okay, so I've done the top layer there now. I'm going to take the pins out just to show you. So it anchors it into place, so your work doesn't fall apart. It all stays in place, but it's not completely stitched from top to bottom. Because it holds it in place as well, it also means that you don't have to hand embroider the whole lot. You can just hand embroider elements of it later on, and it'll still stay together. The stab stitch is really good way to just bring it all together. So I'm going to do a little time lapse now and see if I can do a little bit more on this, and then I'll come back and have a chat about adding hand embroidery later on to decorate the surface. Okay, so that's all stab stitched into place now. I don't know if you could see from the time lapse, but as I was going along, I was taking the pins out because you could probably, well, I don't know, you might have seen earlier that even just using the cotton, there go my pins. Let's just push those off to one side because I don't need them now. Even just using the cotton was enough to kind of get tangled up in all those pins. So as I stab stitch, take the pins out and it makes it much easier. And now you can see you've got this piece now, everything's attached and you don't have any pins in it. So now it's nice and sturdy, it's got the extra layer on the back. And now you can do the really nice bit, which you can take your time over and enjoy, which is to add hand embroidery. One other thing that I was going to say is this is a little offcut that I've got from the top of the dome there, but it also has the text on it. So I usually keep this because I've ironed bond web on the back now. This has also got the sticky glue on it, and that's the sort of thing that I like to cut out and keep, because that quite often, this is Pleasure Gardens Whitley Bay, looks quite nice along the bottom. If you get to the bottom and you've got a little bit of white fabric left over, don't worry, you can either tuck it under and just sew it along the back, or you can snip it off and then you don't see that excess white. But the Pleasure Gardens bit is quite nice if you peel the bond web off the back again to kind of put along the bottom somewhere, maybe with like a little button or something, just a little finishing thing, nice finishing touch. And it also kind of titles it as well, really, because it's got the original title on from the postcard as well. So it's always nice to keep the offcuts because they can still be used in your work as well. Now, I'm not going to go through all the different hand stitches that you could use. I think what I'll do is I'll swap over now to this one, which is on its way to being completed. It's a bit more worked into, and just have a little quick chat about how I work into these with stitch. I'll put some stills on after the video as well of close-ups of this piece, because I realise that while I'm talking it's quite difficult to sort of see where the stitches are. But what I always say in these workshops is the most simple stitches can be the most effective. So using things like running stitch and turning a running stitch into a seed stitch, which just looks, seed stitch gets its name because you literally just look like you've scattered seeds on your fabric, but just with lots of little running stitches, lots of little dashes. So running stitch, seed stitch, a bit of back stitch perhaps, and just some long stitches that could describe long grasses. I'm not sure if you can see this now, but in amongst the grass, in amongst the green here, I've just done some long stitches which can describe grass to give it texture, and also helps just add a little bit of extra, it gives the fabric a bit more security, it'll as well as the stab stitch, just to keep it all in place. And I've put bits of lace over as well, which always look quite nice. This suggests things like sea foam. So where you have the little suggestions of sea foam, if you know how to do things like French knots or chain stitch, then that can add a lot of texture as well. You can see there I've just done some French knots to suggest some flowers, some little wildflowers. And then here there's a little bit of chain stitch just near the net and the lace that I've done, just to add a little bit more texture. But actually clumps of French knots look really, really nice along bits for the sea foam, because it does just give it that extra texture. And again, French knots make really nice flowers as well. So I think sort of my kind of advice on adding decoration on the top of these is just to enjoy it. And sometimes loads of things like running stitch, loads of overlapped simple stitches can add texture and interest in a really simple sort of way, but it's really effective. I use 6-stranded cotton, so just regular embroidery thread that can be split into 6 strands. Let me just grab some for you so I can show you. So that's just a green there that I've grabbed out. So if you're going to use this, if you haven't used it before, it's made up of 6 strands, 6 smaller strands, and if you splay them apart, you can see it's made up of more than 1 strand. And I usually would say for this sort of work, maybe use 2 or 3 strands so you can split it. And you can split them by just grabbing them and pulling straight up and laying out 1, 2, I can't get the last strand, 3 strands. And if you use that, if you sort of do it that way and pull it up instead of trying to pull your threads apart, then you shouldn't get knots when you try and pull them apart. So you take 3 strands out, you can put them all back together and snip the end off so they're all even, and you can start to sew. So basic running stitch, seed stitch, just doing long stitches to create grasses, almost as if you're making pencil marks on the fabric. If you imagine that you were cross-hatching or shading, can add in lots of interest. So with something like this, I think I would tend to do longer kind of horizontal splayed stitches on the grassy areas to suggest long grasses. And then I would do some running stitch along the areas of the sand. And then when it gets to the sea, I've put a little bit of lace over here, so I've got a bit of texture already. But that's when I would get lots of French knots in there as well. And in amongst all of the edges, it's quite nice if where 2 fabrics meet, if you put your textured stitches along there, because it helps to kind of blend those colours as well. And you can also do little running stitch birds in the sky. That's another, oh, I'll bring that down a bit. You can do little running stitch birds in the sky to add a little bit of interest as well. And as I say, if you've got anything on the end, you can just tuck it under and sew it or cut it off, and you can pop your Pleasure Gardens sign in the corner with maybe a little button. The last thing I want to show you is a little frame that I've used for a while now, and it's a really inexpensive way of framing. When I've done these in the past, I've put them onto A4 mount board, because I always think framing is quite a personal choice. So I tend not to frame things all the time. I tend to put them on mount board. I'll just grab this off the wall quickly. I'm sorry if you can hear me moving around. My squeaky chair is there as well. So I've used these for a while. I've bought these from Matalan. They're really inexpensive, but you can get these kind of lead rimmed frames on the internet, and they're a great way if you've got lots of raw edges to display textile work, if you like to see the raw edges. The only thing I would say with them is that if you've got anything like a really thick button on your work, they can have a little bit of trouble pushing together. This one I'm going to pop in now just to show you, because it's fairly flat. I'm going to trim a little bit off the edges because it's a little bit too big for this one. The little dog collage will go back in once I've done this. But let's just, for the sake of demonstration, pop that in now. It's a little bit too wide, but it's a really nice way to display textiles. And it doesn't need any sticking down, because the pressure of the frame, the 2 pieces of glass coming together, is enough to hold it in place. So that's another nice way to frame textile work. I'll add some stills on the end of this video so I can show you some close-ups of some of the embroidery, but I hope you've enjoyed this. The embroidery I'm not going to run through stitch by stitch, because I think the majority of this workshop is actually getting the bones of this together, and once you've done this you can just sew away. But if anyone's got any questions, or you'd like some tips on doing something like French knots, or some ideas on different stitches, then please do feel free to message me. You can get in touch with me at Jessica Kinsey Textiles, or you can get in touch through to me via the Lockdown Art Market as well. But if you, the other thing I was going to add, just as a little sort of closing thing, is if you do have a go at this, if you do try and have a go and you enjoy it and you'd like to share, I'd love to see what you make. I always really enjoy seeing what people have made from workshops. So if you do want to make anything and tag me, or myself, or the Lockdown Market in it on Instagram or Facebook, I'd love to see it, and I'll share it on my stories as well.